This one really is about how I came to be, right? I have been very lucky and I feel very blessed that I was born in a very different culture to the Australian culture. I was born in Lae in Papua New Guinea, and I was born on the February the 2nd, 1955, to a really interesting family. My dad came from Willoughby in Sydney, and my mum came from Dubbo. My mother was 4 years old when her mum died, so she was brought up by great aunts. And her sister Irene moved to Bellevue Hill when she was young, and then I think mum was about 16 when she moved to Bellevue Hill to live with her sister. And so suddenly, as a young girl from a country town, she was suddenly now in the city, you know, having a great life. She started to work at Mark Foy's, and so then she met my dad at a party in Bondi Junction, and both very, very different people. Dad was Church of England, mum was Catholic. Dad was a Liberal person, mum was a Labor person. So they came from very, very different lifestyles and thought processes, which actually made our life very interesting. So Dad was in the war, in World War II, and he was in New Guinea. So he was a junior medic up there, and while he was there being a junior medic, he had to perform things like circumcisions and things like that during the war, purely because of the rainforests and the nature of the wet and so he was sort of open to a lot of things at a very young age. He was only 17 when he was up there, and he was also interested. And so when he left, of course, PNG was bombed. And PNG actually saved Australia because the Japanese went through PNG to get to Australia, but PNG stopped them from getting here. Darwin was pretty well decimated, but then the war was over and that was stopped. So what happened was with PNG, it was a mess. And forestry was brought in, the company of forestry, which was brought in to refix everything that was destroyed. So Dad loved it up there. I don't know what it was. I think that because it was so opposite to the way he was brought up, he had a desire to go back. When he came back from the war, he was working as a sort of an assistant journalist, right? Like working at a paper as a young fella. Met Mum at a party. Fell madly in love with her. My mum was Dad was very, very, very well good looking, and Mum was gorgeous, so that they were actually a really gorgeous couple. And anyway, one thing led to another. They started to date. Was the fact that she was very gorgeous, very beautiful looking, and she worked. It was sort of strange because during the war days and afterwards in the late 40s, she worked in a company as a model, but she was also she also ended up being, sometimes they would ask her to be the date of some celebrity who was visiting Sydney. Like there was an actor called Sabu who became rather a big star in Hollywood in the 40s, with movies like The Thief of Baghdad and that, and Sabu was coming over on a junket to PR a film in Sydney, and they got Mum to be his date for the function. So that sort of opened her mind to a lot of being, like a bit show busy in a way, or, something that's very different to the norm. She also started to date, there was a very famous actor in the 30s called William Powell, and she met William Powell's Jr., William Powell's son, and they dated for a while. And I remember Mum telling me that she was very close to marrying him, which would have set her maybe on a path in Hollywood, but that never happened. Anyway, look, she met my dad. My dad was very, I don't know how you'd say this, she said that he was a very sensitive soul. And I remember once I asked Mum, I said, you know, as we got older, Mum and I were always very close. So, you know, I said to her, how did Dad ask you to marry him? And she said, well, it was really funny. She said, we'd been dating for a little while, seeing each other. And she said, and he was completely smitten with me. Like, he loved me so much. And I remember this day he rang me and he said, can I meet you in Hyde Park? Which is actually opposite to where Mark Foy's was. Mark Foy's is now the big courthouse in the city, right? The Downing Street courthouse. Anyway, so she walked over and he was sitting on a park bench in the park, and she said, I could tell. She said, I could just tell. She said he was so nervous, he was scared, and and I thought, oh my God, he's going to ask me to marry him. Now, I was young and I never thought about getting married like that. Anyway, so she said to me, she said he was sitting there and it came out, you know, I want to marry, will you marry me? And she said, I just looked at him and she said, I looked at him and I thought, oh my God, I feel so sorry for him. I can't say no. And so she actually said yes. And then they got, and look, this is a very interesting story about those days and how things have changed over the years. My father came from a Mason father. Now, if you know about the Masons hate Catholics, right? And my mother was a Catholic. So when Dad and Mum started to date each other, in those days, and Mum used to tell me all this, my mother was never allowed in my father's parents' house. She'd be sitting out, she'd have to sit out in the car, and then he'd go in and get things and do what he needed to do, and then go and, you know, go. And they never let her come into the house, right? Because she was a Catholic. So then what happened was, which I thought that was extraordinary. You know, with the way that we are these days, it just seems so strange. And then what happened was, then once her dad's mother said, oh, if Lee's in the car, bring her in, and just tell her to sit in the dark in the corner, don't say anything, right? And because it was all about my father's father. My dad's name is Richard James. He was always called Jim. Mum was Leona Mary, and she was always called Lee. And Dad's father was named Richard Dick. So what happened was, this is so very strange. I mean, the stories, this is all in the beginning of their relationship, right? When they decided to get married, they got married at the Holy Cross Catholic Church in Woollahra, Edgecliff. There was 2 of her sisters with there, and 2 of his brothers as witnesses. That was it. They never told his parents, right? They got married, they went out for dinner afterwards. For the honeymoon, they went to Camden for the weekend, Dad and Mum, right? Had already discussed what they were moving to New Guinea, right? Mum was excited. That was an adventure, another country she never travelled. So that was all exciting. And then what happened was, Mum and Dad come back from the honeymoon. Mum goes back to Bellevue Hill, and Dad goes back to his parents' house. Never told them that he had just got married. And the night before they left for New Guinea, my father told his parents that he and Mum got married, and that she's coming with him to New Guinea. And that was how my grandparents found out about their marriage. Anyway, so they flew off to this exciting new land, and they moved to Bulalo and to Wau, which is the epicenter of where the forestry was sort of working on re-fixing up the mess. And in those days they lived in dongas, and dongas were also, they were built out of the semicircular buildings on airports, right? So they'd lived in those. It was all very very outhouses, the toilets were outside, blah, 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 blah. So it was all a very different experience. I remember my mother once, I said, did you love it? She said, oh my God, I got to tell you, some of the things that happened to us. She said, I remember I was having a bath. Didn't have showers. She said, I was having a bath. And she said, my towel was draped over the bath. And she said, I picked the towel up and she said, a spider the size of my hand dropped out of the towel onto the floor and scattered away. Right, she said, and I was like, I'm out of here. I'm bloody out of here. Anyway, it never happened. So they were up there, right, in the mountains, and then eventually they moved to Lae, which is, Lae is PNG's second largest city. Port Moresby's the capital, and then Lae, which is in New Guinea. Port Moresby's in Papua, and Lae is in New Guinea. So there's two territories. And then they were renting a house on Rotten Row. So it was a road that was cut out the side of a mountain that overlooked all of Lae. And here's another story. She was sitting in another out toilet, the outhouse, and she said, and I remember one night I had a torch with me, and she said I had to go to the toilet. She said, so I was out in the dark, and she said, and I had a torch, and I'm putting the torch around the ground, and then suddenly I felt like I was being watched. And she said, and as I was moving the torch around, she said the torch went past a couple of eyes. And she said, and then I maneuvered the torch around, and she said, about 6 inches away from my face was the head of a python, a massive python, right? And I looked up and it had curled itself around the rafters of the toilet. And she said, and it was down at my face. And I was just like, she said, I ran. I absolutely ran. She said, so all my adventures of being in this tribal land started very early for me. But you know what? Mum was one of those people who was so extroverted that she just wanted to enjoy the life. And so she actually got into it. And so Dad decided to, he was working at forestry, moved around because he had a bit of journalism in his background. He started the newspaper up there called the Times Courier. He became managing director of the Times Courier. And my father was the first man to write a newspaper for the natives called New Guinea Talk, which was all in Pidgin English. So he understood that the natives would have loved to have known the news also. And so what happened was he decided to write a whole newspaper called New Guinea Talk. Talk is, speaking. And so that was always an entrepreneur. He got in very quickly about a lot of things. He ended up managing a football team. He did a lot of different men up there who were great boxers. And while he was doing all that, Mum was sort of socialising, settling in, and then my mother decided to start the first what became, not here, these days you buy clothes online, but what Mum did, Mum contacted designers in Sydney, very unusually. She had a lot of forethought. She was ahead of her time. She would connect designers in Sydney, she would contact them, and then she'd say that this is what I want to do. Send your collections up to New Guinea, and then I would choose some girlfriends of mine, and we would model them, and we'd put runway shows on, either in venues or at homes, and people would order your clothes from the shows that we did, and that's exactly what she did. And that's, my mother, I always know that my mother had the most beautiful taste in clothes. Everyone knew that she just was, and I'm sure that's the fashion part of me for sure. She always dressed so beautifully. And so I had my dad, who was also a very beautiful cartoonist and artist. So it was him and a beautiful writer. And then Mum, who was an actress. She was doing some plays up there. She was directing. She was modelling. You know, she was into a lot of things. So I had these two very different parents who sort of came together, and we are definitely products. I'm the middle. My parents had their first son, Edwin, Edwin, in the early 50s. And then they had Adrian, and Adrian was born with a hole in his heart. And in those days, there was nothing that the medical profession could do about that. And Adrian died as a baby. Mum, what happened in those days is really weird. You actually, even though the priest was in the Highlands, he wasn't there, Mum actually baptised him and christened him before he died. And then the doctor said to her straight afterwards, you need to have another baby straight away. She was distraught. And that was me. Nicholas was born, and Mummy always used to say to me, you live your life because you're here for two people. You're not only here for yourself, you're here for your brother, right? And then I'm the middle, and then James was born, and then Quentin was born. So I'm the middle of 5 boys. And we had a life and a half. Because my father was such an entrepreneur, and he also had such an important business in New Guinea running the newspaper, his idea was always bringing people up, celebrities, you know, always. So our house was always having parties. And in those days, I remember in the early 60s, there was a very big TV show here in Australia called Bandstand with Brian Henderson. And Bandstand was like the American Bandstand, where they'd introduce all the new singers of the time that were on the hit parade and the top 40, and they'd sing, and you know, and they were it was all like PR for their songs, to, you know, to get them out to the audiences. And so there were the Pacific Games on, and my father decided to bring a lot of the singers from Bandstand up to Sydney, up from Sydney up to Lae. And they did, of course, and Judy Stone, Cold Joy, the Joy Boys, the Crew Brothers, and they all came to my house for a party. My house was my parents were always putting on parties. I can remember nearly every weekend there was some sort of a party on at my parents' place. And so I grew up in a household that was always busy, right? And I'm the middle boy. But this is where I think that my mother had so much of an influence on me, because I'm the one, when my mother was always getting dressed to go to a wedding or go wherever, she'd always ask me my opinion as a little kid, how she looked. So she'd be trying things on and say, what do you think, Dal, what do you think, blah, blah, blah. And another thing about my parents, this was my mother, instigation, we never were left at home. If there was a wedding on, you know, the Huxley kids were there. A lot of times no other kids were there. If there was a premiere of a film, there were always black tie doos there. My mother made sure that we came to the premiere with them. You know, she loved her boys, and she was very proud of us, and she took us everywhere. And the unusual thing about it is that my eldest brother, Edwin, grew up to be one of Australia's most famous cartoonists, caricaturists. So a lot of his artwork was in East Leagues Club in Bondi Junction. And so he got that part of Dad, the beautiful drawer. He was a beautiful illustrator and painter, so he got that. And yeah, so, you know, the boys got a little bit of this and a little bit of that from both parents. And I got the artistic part from my dad and the love of writing, and my mother was a beautiful writer too. And I got the fashion sense, the film sense, that whole other area also. So I got the whole thing. I got the whole thing. And so what happened was, so when you're up there, right, you're with the natives, right? Native kids. Most white families up there, there were the Europeans, which were us, which was what they called the white people, and there were the natives. And what happened was a lot of Europeans, because it was in those days, you just couldn't fly up to PNG, right? It wasn't about tourism because it was a mess. in the early 50s and late 40s. My parents got married in 1948 and went straight up there. But what happened was but you had to have something specific that the government said, yes, you can come to help us refix the place, regenerate the whole of the country. And so my parents' friends were very fabulously interesting people, right? There was just, everyone who was up there was really interesting. And so, the social life was fantastic. But what I was saying, that everybody also had a native family or a native working for them as the housemaid, the security, the clean, whatever. We always had a family working for us. So we, in our house, we had this house, and down that there was always another house built on the property where the family lived. And so I was with the natives all the time. I found it so fascinating. I mean, you know what? I never even thought about it. It was just a part of life that you learn Pidgin English when you're a little kid. You speak to the natives in Pidgin. Sometimes on a Saturday, as a little kid, I'd be gone all day with the native kids. Well, my parents, my father would. The newspaper office would be opened on a Saturday until about 1 o'clock. In the morning, Saturday morning, we kids would go to a movie matinee. We'd come home and then I'd be gone. And I wouldn't come back until dark, right? And then in those days too, you'd come back and then Mum would say, we're all getting dressed, we're going to the lake club. And there was always a cocktail party on or something at the lake club. So it was non-stop this and that. And so what I'm thinking is, when I'd come home of a night before, it was getting dark, I'd come home, but I'd stick with the native kids and the natives, and we'd be down at their house, and they'd always be cooking something over an open fire, and someone would be playing the guitar, and we'd be all singing, and it was just such a normal existence for us. And it was only when Mum would call up and say, come on kids, up you get, come up here, have showers, we're going out. And then so I'd leave and go up there. And so I was greatly influenced. The funny, strange thing about this is my house has got a lot of tribal in it. Sepik masks and Sepik shields and, just a lot of tribal influences. But in our house in Ley, we had nothing. Mum hated it. So it's very weird. Mum did not like it at all. I think it was also to do with where you are on the chain of existence. So she used to think all the tribal stuff and the sculptures and the shell work and all that was for poor people, because it were the natives who was doing it. So it was all to do with being poor, which is very strange, because now it's all very expensive. But so our house never had anything to do with native in it. But it must have stayed with me, influenced me, because, it really became a very important part of my life. Not then, but obviously later on, it sort of, it found its way back to me in the fact that I love it so much. And I do portraiture of, tribal portraiture, and, I love tribal prints, I love tribal work, I love anything, any culture where there's handwork in it to create something beautiful from it. And very different to my brothers. My brothers and I are very, very different. My oldest brother died some years ago. I've got two younger brothers who are still alive. But their whole life was very different to mine, and, my life has been all about being creative. So when we were up there, and I still to this day talk so much, look at me, I am talking about it. I always talk about my upbringing. I remember it so well. I remember going to my first Holy Communion, all in white, to St Mary's Church, all in white, black shoes, maybe white shirt, white shorts, right? And walking into the church with all the native kids standing in line coming with me. I was one of the very few white kids having my first Holy Communion on that special day. So, so there was always, you just sometimes wish now that kids had that opportunity to experience the life that I experienced, the freedom, you know. I was surrounded, you know, I had a very interesting father in one vein, and I had a fabulously interesting mum in another. Mum was a flirt, she was gorgeous, she would walk into a room. My mum's friends would used to say to me, she said, your mother would walk into a room and the whole room would stop. You know, she would just take over. She was effervescent, she was fabulous, she loved to party, she loved to dance, she loved music. She just took over, and she said, and your parents were both very gorgeous people. People used to say to me, which is very strange, but when you get older and you can talk about things, they used to say that my parents were very sexual, which is very interesting. She said they oozed sex appeal, right? So that, I think to myself, I can understand and appreciate the fact that they were good looking, but the fact that they actually oozed that sexuality about each other was something that I think is really fabulous, because I don't see it these days a lot at all. Over all the many, many years that I've been to parties and seen people as they've been, early on in their lives together and as they've progressed in life, I don't look at people and I think, you are such a sexual couple together. And I'm actually very proud that my parents were like that, and that they made their mark, right? Because people did notice. So, look, I didn't know what I was going to do because I was a little kid. But I remember what happened when we came down to Sydney. There's a lot of stories to tell about my life and the reasons why I veered in certain directions. Right, number one, my mother, where their house was, the original house, overlooked the airport and the airstrip. My mother saw a lot of crashes in those days. So she saw a lot of people killed, and which made her very terrified about flying, right? And so when we eventually moved to Sydney, right, she never flew again. But in those days, when my brother started, we would come down maybe once or every 2 years to a family reunion or something, and it was just that flight from Lae to Sydney and back, right? So Mum was very, very scared and nervous about flying. And then later on, I'll tell you about my adventures with my mum and her ashes. A lot of them are still in that box there, right, where I've been taking my mum's ashes around the world. That's another story. So what happened was, in 1965, the natives were getting restless. So the natives actually wanted their independence. And so there were things that were starting to happen that had never happened before, break and entry, not horrible things, but things that were changing. Like in those days in Lae, you never saw a house that had a fence around it. Never. All the houses were just beautiful lawns, and then a drive in, drive out onto the street, right? No one ever had fences. There was no security at homes and anything like that. So it was a beautiful heaven on earth, and just a simple, beautiful lifestyle. I'm thinking to myself, I remember there's a thing in Papua New Guinea called Sing Sing, and it's when all the highland people come down, all the different provinces come down to one big field, and they're all dressed in their own particular regalia, the way that their costume, right? And they all come to this big, fabulous field, and it's sing. So they sing, they play instruments, they beat their drums, all day. And they do stories and all that. And I remember as a kid, I can even still smell it. There'd be they used to put this stuff on their bodies, and it was from the sap of trees, and it had this sort of really strong, thick smell, right? And it used to, because our house was close to the big main field, right, in our area, the smell would come across the skies, and and it'd be about like maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or, and I could smell it, and I'd think, oh my God, Sing Sing's on, and so I'd run. I remember as a little kid, not even bare feet, no shoes, nothing, just run straight over to the field and be there all day with all the kids watching Sing Sing, and it was extraordinary. I mean, how many kids get to have that experience? It was wonderful. And there's that tribal thing again, body paint and shells and headdresses and amazing colours and the use of bird of paradise feathers and all those things that I just obviously took in, that the experience was so special. Anyway, so what happened was the natives were getting restless, and my dad had been up there literally for 25 years and Mum had been there for 17 years. It was time for my brother to go to school, to high school, education. We were taught by Dutch nuns at St Mary's, and but that was up until 6th class, and then most Europeans, the white people, would send their kids down to boarding school. So Mum decided that Edwin was going to Waverley College. We were brought up Catholic, and so my brother was sent to boarding school. And in 1965, with the natives getting restless, Mum decided that enough was enough. Nicholas was going to have to go. James was going to go. Quentin was going to go. All my boys are going to be in Sydney. And she couldn't stand the fact that she would see us just once a year or something. So and I remember this day so well. She was flying out on a Monday to have a look at houses where we were going to live. Dad had the newspaper, so Dad couldn't come, right? Now, in 1963, my mother found out that she was riddled with cancer. And she was 7 months pregnant with Quentin. She'd always gone to the same doctor. She'd had 5 kids, but she was pregnant with Quentin, and the doctor said, it's just about your pregnancy, and she was saying, no, it's not, something's very different here, it's not. And there was a specialist called Professor Smythe visiting, doing lectures around New Guinea, and he was in Ley, and Mum made an appointment to see him, and he did tests on her, and through her womb and everything, and she was riddled with cancer. He told my father that my mum was going to die. My mother was 37, and that it was rather impossible for her to live through this. My mother was given 2 choices. She could go to Brisbane for radium treatment, right? Which is what they called it in those days, with the promise that they will get as much as they can, or she said, or to be operated on. And my mother said to Frank Smythe, I want you to operate on me. And he said, well, that's not my special thing. But she said, I trust you. She said, if you hadn't been here doing your tour, I would never have known that I was riddled with it. And she said, there's something about you that I trust. And she said, and I want you to operate on me and take it all. And she was 37 years of age. He said, well, we're going to have to take the baby straight away. She said, no, you're not. Right? So she waited for another 2 months until Quentin was born. This is what's amazing about the female body. With the cancer going through her, right, when my brother was born, he was born in a white mucus sac. So the female body covered the baby in a sac so that the strands of the cancer couldn't get to him. And it came out like to protect him, right? So it was amazing. So she had to wait. Cancer was carrying on through her. She had Quentin, right? And then she decided she was going to be operated on. Dr. Smythe said, yes, he will do it. And she moved down to Port Moresby Hospital, where she said, I want you to operate and don't stop until you take it all, right? Get it all. She was put in a room with a Carmelite nun. Now the Carmelites are nuns that are not allowed to talk, right? So there was her and the Carmelite nun in this room, right? Which she, being a devout Catholic, she also thought that there was a reason for that. You know, there was something very special about that. Anyway, my dad was told that my mother wasn't going to return, that she will die. So what my dad did, because he had the newspaper, all the kids were given to families to be looked after. So I was given to the Farrellies, and you know, James went somewhere else, and Quentin as a baby was with other people, Edwin went somewhere else. So we were all separated, and Mum was operated on, and she came through it, and she came home. Right now, my mother died at 86, right? So she outlived Pa one, Biddy Fernan. She outlived all her girlfriends, and she was told she was going to die at 37. And a lot of that to do with is, I think, attitude. Life is what you make it. That's, if I wrote a book, that's what I would call it. Life is what you make it, right? And it's all about attitude. So anyway, so you know, she went on, came down, and I remember she was flying out on a Monday, and she said to me on a Sunday, Mum and I were very close, and I was 10, and she said to me, do you want to come with me? And I'm like, what? She said, do you want to come? Do you want to fly down with me tomorrow? And the first thing I thought of, I said, what about my friends? What about my friends? I've got all my friends. And she said, I'll drive you around today for you to say goodbye to all of them. And that's what we did, right? Drove around to Shane Crowley and all my friends that I was in school with, and said, I'm going with Mum tomorrow to Sydney, right? And wow, and you know what? I've never been back to Lae since, so it was sort of meant to be. So we came down, Mum and I came down. We stayed at Leswell Private Hotel in Edgecliff while we looked for a place to live, you know, and then so eventually Dad would come down and bring Quentin as the baby with him, and then we found this place on Tamarama Beach, big house on Tamarama Beach, right on the beach, and that's where they rented for a while until they bought an apartment in Waverley. And so that just shows you the progression of how, you know, you're born into a certain culture. I've always thought if I know anybody who gets the possibility of moving to another country for a while, right, I always say go for it. Go for it for you, for your partner, for the kids that you might have, because being brought up in a different culture opens your mind to so much in the world. You know, I actually do, I feel sorry for people who live in areas and their life has always just pretty well been the same. You know, the existence is the same from when they're born to when they're in their teens, and then they go out in the workforce. You know, and I just think, wow, I had such an amazing experience, and that's, I think, and I took it in so much. I remember it so clearly that it has been a very important part of me and my life. My attitude, my being extroverted, being quirky, being direct, being honest. I hate superficiality. I hate pretentious people. I just love the real, and I can be very cutting. I shoot from the hip, but that's just the way my makeup is. That's just who I am, and that is my upbringing, and that is because of my father and especially my mum.